Have you ever wondered how far someone can go when deprived of everything that makes it human? Perhaps this thought has crossed your mind at some point in pain or indignation, but what I will tell today exceeds any limit you can imagine. Among the shadows of the old houses of New Orleans, I discovered a story that the authorities tried to erase from official records. While researching dusty documents in the former Orleans Parish Library, I found sealed police reports that should never see the light of day. The names were scratched, the dates changed, but the details, these remained untouched, as scars that refused to disappear. What happened on that 1882 night has forever changed the balance of power in the southern plantations. After what I will reveal, you will never look at the old houses of New Orleans in the same way. If you value stories that unravel the darkest secrets of our society, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any of these investigations that conventional history books would never count. What I found out about Esther Marie and that new moon night will make you question everything you thought you know about resistance, revenge, and justice. The ruins of the old plantation must still haunt Bayou St. John's swamp margins near New Orleans. What remains of the main mansion rises like a spectrum among the Spanish moss-covered cypresses, their walls collapsed by vines that seem strangers to the memories of the past. The air carries a sweet and putrefied aroma, a mixture of wildflowers and the constant decomposition process that characterizes Louisiana's swamps. No visitor remains there after twilight, when insect sounds intensify and something older seems to awaken in the shadows. The place remains empty not only by the state of abandonment, but from what everyone in the region know. Too much blood has been spilled on that soil so that anything good can be born of it again. What happened on that night of September 1882 represents a fundamental truth about human nature. When you denied someone your dignity for a long time, when all a person loves is destroyed, what remains is no longer a common human being, but something transformed, capable of acts that challenge understanding. Esther Marie's revenge was not just an act of retribution, but a ritual of purification through horror. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. The plantation owed to an agricultural enterprise, but a microcosm of systemic cruelty that persisted even after the formal abolition of slavery. With more than 800 acres of fertile lands dedicated mainly to the cultivation of cotton and sugarcane, the complex included the imposing house with its 22 white columns, the deteriorated housing of workers, the processing shed, and the feared cabin of the overseers, situated strategically between fields and accommodation. The property owned the family owed to 3 generations, but after the Civil War, they converted their business model. Officially, they had no more slaves, but the debt servitude system that implemented the old slaves and their descendants under virtually identical conditions. Workers signed contracts they could not read, accumulated debts impossible to pay off the property store, and were prevented from a combination of legal threats and explicit violence. The routine in the plantation began at 4 in the morning with the touch of the bronze bell, whose penetrating sound was terrified by all. In the fields, men and women worked under the relentless sun of Louisiana, supervised by 8 mules armed with braided leather whips with metal, known as persuasers. The punishment system included the public trunk, where the offenders were exposed for days without proper food, and the dreaded box, a confined space under the barn where an adult human being barely fit. The workers' housing formed a semicircle behind the main house, deteriorated wooden structures with roofs that leaked during the frequent rains. Each cabin housed up to 3 families, without partitions for privacy and with only straw on the floor to sleep. The smell of mold and excrement impregnated the air, mixed with the odor of constant fear. In the center of this system, as well-lubricated gears of an oppression machine, were the overseers. Chosen for their brutality and lack of empathy, these men represented the executing arm of the family's will. They were rewarded for maintaining productivity high at any human cost, and while the cicadas sang announcing, "Ma, it is a hot and moist summer night," none of them could imagine that in a few months, their methods would create no submission, but a planned fury gale with surgical accuracy. Esther Marie Baptiste was walking between 2 worlds with a skill that few had. Born in 1848 in the plantation he owes herself, the daughter of a house slave and a French doctor who occasionally visited the property, grew with access to knowledge normally denied to those of her condition. His mother, Delphine, served as a kitchen assistant and learned the secrets of Creole cuisine, as well as deep knowledge about medicinal herbs and natural poisons, wisdom that meticulously transmitted to her daughter. Esther Marie had a brown hive eyes that seemed to change shade according to the light, a trace inherited from her father who never recognized her. His medium, toned skin and features that mixed African and European heritage allowed them to transit with relative ease between different social spaces. At the age of 18, he learned secretly to read Madame Laveau, a voodoo practitioner who visited the plantation to sell amulets and herbs. What made Esther truly exceptional, however, were his skills as a healer. Its long, agile fingers could either relieve pain and, if necessary, provoke it with absolute accuracy. I knew each plant of the surrounding swamps, each root, each fungus. He knew which combinations induced hallucinations, which caused paralysis without killing, which accelerated or delayed bleeding. This knowledge, passed by generations of women of their lineage, made it indispensable in the plantation. Henry himself owes the owner, resorted to his services when conventional doctors failed to treat his chronic drop. This unique position granted Esther rare privileges, permission to circulate freely through the property, access to the big house, and even authorization to visit the French market in New Orleans to buy specific ingredients. While preparing poultice and tincture for you, I watched. While treating wounds opened by whips in workers' bodies, he memorized. When tea served the lady she should do, and her visits he listened. Esther thus cultivated a dual reputation. For owners and female was the efficient and submissive healer. For plantation workers, it represented silent hope and resistance. He kept a small herb garden at the back of his cabin, the only individual space granted to him due to his function. There, under the moonlight of Louisiana, she whispered old words in Creole while her skilled hands prepared both medicines and other substances whose nature kept an absolute secret. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth, if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The year 1882 brought a climb of atrocities to the plantation must have exceeded even the usual brutality patterns. The decline of cotton prices in the international market pressed Henry must exist maximum productivity at minimum costs. In January, he reduced the weekly rations of workers in 1/3, claiming difficult times. In March, the daily crop quotas increased in 50%, making them virtually impossible to fulfill. The punishments multiplied. In April, the chief overseer, William Sharp, implemented what he called economy of scale in punishments. Instead of individually punishing those who did not fulfill quotas, selected a worker per day to publicly receive 20 whip, as educational example. In May, 3 children died of malnutrition within 2 weeks. The bodies were simply thrown in the waters of Bayou without ceremonies or milestones. June brought the new regulation of silence. Any conversation during work resulted in immediate whipping. In July, when a drought punished the region, workers were deprived of water during office hours to encourage greater efficiency. Those who fainted with exhaustion were dragged to the shadow only when they completely stopped moving. August witnessed the arrival of 2 new makers, brothers with past army, known for the technique of using warm tweezers to extract nails from lazy workers. His reputation preceded them, and his first public demonstration of methods took place on the first Sunday of the month, after the mandatory religious service. Esther Marie watched all this. He treated his back, applied ointments to the burns, whispered words of comfort as he cleaned infected wounds. His kind hands relieved physical suffering, but his eyes recorded every atrocity, every scream, every tear. Behind the compassionate expression that showed the patience and the servitude mask that presented to the masters, the LGO was crystallized inside. Not a simple desire for revenge, but the calculated certainty that a definitive answer had become necessary. Esther Marie's final transformation of Healer the Avenger took place on September 12, 1882. Her only daughter, Lucille, a 17th-year-old girl who worked at the main house as an assistant to the housekeeper, had attracted Edmund's unwanted attention owed to the owner's youngest son. After weeks of harassment, The young woman repelled him firmly than prudence would advise. That suffocating afternoon, Edmund, assisted by 3 overseers, dragged Lucille to the basement of Casa Grande. The young girl's screams echoed for hours. When they finally allowed Esther to see her daughter, she found her unrecognizable swollen eyes, broken lips, body bit marks, and obvious signs of multiple violation. Lucille, in shock, just repeatedly murmured, "Water, water," his fixed eyes at some point beyond the wooden ceiling. Esther carefully cleaned each wound of her daughter with rose water and rail infusion. He combed his tangled hair with his fingers, singing softly an ancient Lullen song in Creole. He warmed milk with honey and tried to make her drink, but Lucille just turned her face. For 3 days, Esther remained next to her daughter, applying herb sparkles to her herbs, whispering promises of better days, of flowers that would bloom again. In the early hours of the 4th day, Lucille stopped breathing. His body had finally surrendered to internal damage caused by the brutality suffered. Esther did not shout, did not thin in tears, as they would wait. She washed her daughter's body with lavender-fragrant water, dressed her in the only good dress she had, fought her hair with red tapes like Lucille liked it on special occasions. In the light of the waning moon, Esther buried his daughter under the large oak within the limits of the property, where Lucille used to play as a child. There was no priest, there was no formal ceremony, only Esther, a small bonfire of aromatic herbs, and an oath whispered in the wind. By his blood, by my blood, by the blood of all who have suffered on this earth, they will know the true pain. He then cut the palm of his left hand, letting the blood drip over the fresh land of land, sealing a pact that went beyond common human understanding. When he returned to his cabin at dawn, his eyes had acquired a different quality, deeper, older. Who saw her that day reported after something fundamental had changed in Esther Marie. His posture, his voice, even his odor seemed different, as if part of it had remained in that grave, and something much older had filled the empty space. The plantation owed to the multiple layers of cruelty, each complementing and reinforcing the others. At the top of the pyramid, the family Owo, Henry, the 62-year-old patriarch, known for its calculating coldness and obsession with profit above any human consideration. His wife Carolyn, whose social refinement masked a cold indifference to the suffering of others, and his 3 children. Thomas, the firstborn and future heir, who combined his father's cruelty with a more sophisticated intelligence. Edmund, the middle son, notorious for his excess of impulsive fury and depraved appetites. And Charlotte, the youngest, who at the age of 19 already showed a special talent for the psychological manipulation of the house's servants. Below them, forming the backbone of the control system, were the 8 overseers, each specialized in some particular form of violence. William Sharp, the chief overseer, a former fugitive slave, whose 7-pointed whip rarely remained dry for a full day. Tall and thin like a scarecrow, with gray eyes that never blinked enough time, Sharp was proud to have never allowed a single successful escape in his 23 years of service. The Jackson brothers Emmett and Elijah Newley arrived Georgia, bringing refined torture techniques in prisoners during the Civil War. Experts in extracting confessions through sensory deprivation and joint manipulation. Michael O'Donnell, Irish explosive temperament, responsible for training children for work in the fields, a method that consisted mainly of regular beating to form character. Frederick DuPont, mestizo and former slave himself, whose brutality against his equals exceeded that of whites, in a desperate attempt to solidify his precarious position in the hierarchy. Samuel Green, deeply religious, who justified each atrocity with distorted biblical passages, whipping the rhythm of psalms sung aloud. Victor Reeves, the youngest of the overseers, an apprentice eager to prove their value through innovations in methods punitive, a specialist in injuries calculated to maximize pain without permanently compromising work capacity. And finally, Tobias Miller, a former Stone, in charge of the most severe punishments, whose huge hands and knowledge of anatomy allowed him to inflict precise damage to internal organs without leaving visible marks. The catalyst event that sealed the fate of these men took place in the first week of September, when an attempted escape coordinated by 5 workers was brutally repressed. The fugitives were recaptured on the banks of Bayou by Sharp and his hunting dogs. As an exemplary punishment, they were chained to the central trunk for 3 days under the scorching sun, receiving only enough water so as not to die. On the 3rd day, Henry Devereux ordered each overseer to apply 10 lashes to each fugitive, totaling 400 blows. Esther was then called to keep them alive, not by mercy, but to prolong the suffering and the lesson. As he treated his back to Josiah, a 40-year-old man who had tried to escape to find his wife sold to another plantation, he whispered his last words, "End it, sister. Not in their way, but ours." He died the next morning, despite Esther's efforts. That night, contemplating Josiah's body being dragged to an ordinary ditch, Esther Marie made her final decision. It would not be just a personal revenge for the daughter, but a response to generations of suffering. It would be the birth of a method that would soon spread throughout the southern states as an uncontrollable fire. The decisive factor was the arrival of a letter announcing the visit of potential buyers interested in acquiring young copies for a plantation in Mississippi. The auction was scheduled for the end of September. The final humiliation, the water drop that overflowed the cup of patience, occurred precisely a week after Lucille's funeral. By express order of Edmund Ode, Esther was summoned to the main house to demonstrate his medicinal knowledge to visitors interested in techniques for efficient maintenance of workers. The true intention, however, turned out to be another. Upon arriving at the main hall, he found Edmund and 3 other young landowners in an advanced state of drunkenness. On the walls had preached grotesque designs representing Lucille in degrading positions. "Show these gentlemen how their daughter danced," Edmund ordered, his bourbon-loaded breath invading Esther's personal space. When she remained immobile, low eyes and fists clenched, William Sharp emerged from the shadows with her whip. UOO commented that her herbs to headache recently lost effectiveness, he said with false concern. Maybe a reminder about the consequences of incompetence? Forced to a circle formed by men, Esther was forced to dance while drunken owners splashed her with wine and commented on how her daughter had more enjoyable hips. For 2 hours, he endured obscene comments, unscrewed touches, and explicit references to Lucille's destination. When they finally allowed them to leave, the stained dress and the painful body of the forced falls, Edmund threw some coins at his feet. "For the funeral," he said between laughter. "Buy something beautiful for her to use in hell." Esther collected the coins in silence. His face, which had previously kept a mask of submission, underwent a subtle but deep transformation. Something ancestral and terrible permeated his features for a moment fleeting, enough to momentarily silence even drunk men. At that very moment, his decision is no longer emotional to becoming mathematical, precise, inevitable. When walking back to his cabin in the light of the stars, each step solidified his resolution. There would be no more hesitation. There would be no spilled tears. Only the methodical planning of what would be known, years later, in the whispered reports between plantations, such as the Baptist method. A phrase that would make the Southern firmly tremble and twice the locks of their rooms before bedtime. Esther Marie Baptiste's revenge plan that same night began in the light of a single tallow candle. Sitting on the dirt floor of his cabin, drawing complex symbols with sacred wood ashes, Esther mentally mapped each aspect of the plantation Must Dorough. He knew every ranging board, every door that needed oil, every window that could be opened without noise. Years treating the residents of the property had given them access to precious information. Those who slept deeply, those who suffered from insomnia, which rooms remained empty on certain nights. His first decision was to select accomplices. Few, loyal, and with strong personal motivations, the sufficiency entree. He chose Isaiah, formerly relegated to ordinary worker after losing part of his right hand in an accident with machinery. He knew the times and routines of all the overseers better than any other. Ruth, the main house washerwoman, whose 2 twin daughters had been sold separately the previous month. He had unrestricted access to all rooms and knew every possible hiding place. Solomon, responsible for the stables, man of impressive physical strength and absolute silence. He had lost his tongue as a punishment for insolence years before. Ezekiel, former Union Army soldier who now lived in disguise among workers. He knew how to handle weapons and planned strategies. Jericho, young auxiliary cook, capable of memorizing whole conversations heard in the kitchen and with deep knowledge of herbs that complemented Esther's. For 3 consecutive nights, they gathered at Esther's cabin under the pretext of spiritual healing sessions, one of the few activities that the overseers tolerated for their own superstition. There they meticulously outlined each phase of the plan. First phase, resource collection. Ruth would divert small amounts of laudano from the medical pantry of the main house. Solomon would extract secretions from certain plants from the swamps. Jericho would separate specific herbs from the kitchen. Second phase, precise mapping. Isaiah documented the nocturnal habits of each overseer, who drank until I fell asleep, who visited the women's huts, who played cards until late. Third phase, preparation of the land. Ezekiel identified all possible escape routes and secure meeting points in surrounding swamps. Fourth phase, synchronization of watches. Using the phases of the moon as a calendar, they established the exact date, the night of September 26th, when the new moon would guarantee dark darkness, and, coincidentally, the eve of the arrival of slave buyers. Fifth phase, distribution of specific functions. Each participant received detailed tasks, with contingency plans if something went wrong. The central element, what Esther called the Black Widow Kiss secret, would be a special mixture of herbs and substances she would prepare, something she would paralyze without killing immediately, allowing her victims to remain aware throughout the subsequent procedure. 2 weeks were devoted to the collection of specific ingredients, refinement of techniques, memorization of schedules. Esther worked tirelessly, dividing his time between his normal functions in the plantation and the meticulous preparation of each necessary element. His accomplices noted a gradual transformation in his behavior, the kind healer giving way to something colder, more calculating, more ruthless. The night before the execution of the plan, Esther gathered the group one last time. Instead of words of encouragement or promises of liberation, they offered each one the opportunity to give up without reprisals. No one accepted. Under the handy light of the candles, they performed an old ritual, mixing drops of blood from each participant in a small clay bowl. "We are not killers," said Esther, as the bowl circulated. "We have been the hands of justice for a long time denied. What we will do tomorrow is not a crime, but an account adjustment." At midnight, they drank special tea prepared with valerian roots and other soothing herbs. "Sleep well," instructed Esther. "Tomorrow we will be born again in a different world." The morning of September 26, 1882, dawned under an oppressively charged sky, low and dense clouds promising a storm that seemed reluctant to collapse. The thick and immovable air made it difficult to breathe, as if the atmosphere itself was loaded with omen. In the main house of the plantation should reado, preparations for receiving buyers scheduled for the next day occurred at a rapid pace. Caroline must personally supervise the cleaning of the main hall, ruthlessly criticizing every imperfection her trained eyes detected. "These bowls still have fingerprints. Refaults everything," he ordered the young maid that he treated visibly, before collecting the crystal berate again. In the adjacent office, Henry must have reviewed 17 active selected 17 documents for sale. Young people between 14 and 22 years old, evaluated by their physical strength and reproductive potential. In workers' housing, the day was under palpable tension. Those marked for the next day auction moved as automatons, fixed empty looks at some point beyond the visible horizon. The others avoided direct eye contact, fearful to demonstrate any solidarity that could be interpreted as insubordination. Meanwhile, the 5 conspirators performed their everyday functions, studied. Isaiah supervised the maintenance of tools with efficiency silences the. Ruth washed and meticulously passed the tablecloths to the banquet the next day, occasionally introducing small amounts of yellowish powder into the strategic folds. Solomon fed the horses with the same impassive expression always, although now repeatedly verified the exact position of each mount. Ezekiel noticed fences at the farthest limit of the property, mentally mapping each inch of the ground. Jericho prepared bread and cakes, discreetly separating small portions of spices in double paper that hid in his apron sewing. Esther Marie, in turn, had been summoned to the main house to prepare digestive tonics for the banquet. He worked silently in the small laboratory adjacent to the kitchen, his agile hands manipulating herbs and dyes with the usual accuracy. No one noticed that occasionally his lips moved in silent prayers, nor that the proportions of certain ingredients were subtly differentiated from usual revenues. By falling in the afternoon, a festive atmosphere settled among the overseers. As a tradition was on the eve of important auctions, William Sharp organized an early celebration on the cabin that served as his headquarters. Cheap whiskey barrels were opened, distributed deck cards, and gradually the 8 men responsible for the discipline of the plantation relaxed in a false sense of security. Outside, the sky finally fulfilled its promise. Heavy rain began to fall, initially into spacing. Thick drops that soon turned into dense water curtains. Occasional lightning illuminated the landscape, momentarily revealing figures that moved with purpose in the shadows between the cabins. As the night advanced, the feast of the overseers became noisier. Obscene jokes and thick laughs escaped through the cracks of the cabin, competing with the roar of the thunder. Around 9 o'clock, Ruth appeared with a tray of pellets of molasses, sent by the Lady Owo as thanks for her hard work, he announced with his low eyes and servile voice. The men, already drunk and satisfied with this unexpected recognition, devoured the sweets without hesitation. About an hour later, the first sign that something was not right. O'Donnell, the Irishman, knocked his glass and staggered out, murmuring over fresh air. No one worried. Drinking even sick was common in these celebrations. One by one, however, the other overseers began to show similar symptoms. Dragged speech, uncoordinated movements, blurred vision. They still attributed to alcohol, until Sharp, the most resistant of them, realized that their legs did not respond to the commands of his brain. Something is wrong, he said, trying to get up and collapsing on the table. His last conscious words were a request for incoherent help before his facial muscles paralyzed in a grotesque grimace, while his eyes remained open, alert, and increasingly terrified. Around midnight, when the storm had reached its apex outside, the cabin door opened silently. Esther Marie entered first, followed by her accomplices. The 8 female were in various states of paralysis, some completely immobilized in their chairs, some fallen on the floor, but all with open and conscious eyes, unable to emit any sound beyond weak moans. Esther walked slowly through the enclosure, examining each man with the same clinical attention that he would devote to ordinary patients. He wore a simple white dress, loose hair adorned with small red flowers. In his hands, a leather bag containing various instruments, some doctors, some adapted from agricultural tools. "Good night, gentlemen," he said in a calm and melodious voice, as if he was simply making a social visit. "Forgive the intrusion, but we have important issues to discuss." He made a gesture, and Solomon began to drag men to specific positions in the cabin, organizing them in a semicircle. None managed to offer significant resistance. Ruth closed all the windows and covered them with dark cloths. Jericho lit strategically positioned lamps to create a particular game of light and shadow. Isaiah checked the ties that, although unnecessary given the state of paralysis, served as a powerful symbol of what was to come. Ezekiel remained at the door, attentive to any unexpected approach. With all the preparations completed, Esther positioned himself in the center of the semicircle, so that each overseer could see it clearly. He opened his bag and began to remove his instruments by placing them carefully over a white towel extended to the floor. "The human body is truly fascinating," he began, as if teaching a class. "So resilient and at the same time, so fragile. In my years as a healer, I learned exactly where to touch to relieve the pain." He paused a significant break, his eyes traveling the paralyzed faces. "And also where to play to cause it as intensely as possible." What followed was a methodical and systematic demonstration that lasted almost 5 hours. To each overseer, Esther has given specific attention, carefully relating his actions to the particular atrocities that each man had committed over the years. For William Sharp, whose whip had torn hundreds of his back, she demonstrated precisely as nerves and tendons could be separated with the same surgical accuracy. For Brothers Jackson, burns experts, applied compounds that generated progressive internal heat sensations, explaining in detail the physiological changes they were experiencing. Throughout the procedure, he maintained an educational tone, almost teacher. There was no evident anger in his voice, only a clinical determination that made the experience even more terrifying for his victims. Occasionally, it administered small doses of stimulants to ensure that none of them lose consciousness prematurely. Mr. O'Donnell remembers the little Sarah, just 9 years old, whom you whipped even unconsciousness by overthrowing a bucket of water. She never fully recovered her hearing after the blows on her head. Allow me to demonstrate precisely what happened inside her skull that day. Or, Mr. Miller, his specialty has always been internal damage without visible marks, isn't it? An admirable ability, I must recognize. Today, I would like to share some techniques that I learned from the former healers of Haiti. I believe you will find particular academic interest in this demonstration. As night was advanced, the other 4 participants performed their own specific functions. Ruth collected fluids in small, meticulously labeled vials. Solomon positioned and repositioned the bodies as needed, with the accuracy of an experienced surgery assistant. Jericho prepared mixtures and compounds under Esther's whispered guidance. Ezekiel kept the time count, ensuring that each phase of the process respected precise schedule. Just before dawn, when the last procedure was completed, Esther gathered his instruments and methodically cleared each. He then leaned over William Sharp, the chief overseer whose eyes still showed full consciousness despite the destroyed body. Don't worry, Mr. Sharp. You won't die for a few hours yet. I want you to have enough time to contemplate everything that happened here. He approached his lips to the man's ear and whispered, "This is the method my daughter inspired. Soon, others will perfect him." With a silent gesture, he indicated to others that it was time to leave. They left the cabin exactly as they had found it, except for the 8 men who now lay in diverse states of anatomical deconstruction, still conscious, still understanding, unable to issue more than weak sighs. The last image they saw was Esther, framed on the door, placing a finger over his lips in a universal gesture of silence before disappearing into the darkness that preceded dawn. Before leaving the hub of the overseers, Esther performed one last ritual. From his bag, he removed a small package containing land from his daughter's tomb, mixed with specific herbs and sealed with his own blood. He drew a complete circle around the 8 men, murmuring old words in Creole, French, and even older African languages. He lit 7 small candles at strategic points, representing the 7 powers, the 7 doors, the 7 ways. In the center, he placed a clay container containing a mixture of rum, chili pepper, black chicken blood, and bone powder. He lit him with a unique phosphorus, producing a bluish flame that illuminated the agonizing faces of the overseers with spectral light. "May your spirits never find peace," he said formally. That wandered eternally on the boundaries between worlds, neither alive nor dead, just as they kept so many of us in similar limbo. Leaving the cabin did not locate the door. On the contrary, he deliberately ajar her, an invitation, a testimony, a statement. Meanwhile, in the workers' huts, a coordinated movement took shape. Isaiah and Ezekiel had worked all night, moving from family to family, conveying precise instructions to the imminent exodus. Each person received a specific function and a meeting place designated at the depths of the swamp, where Solomon had already prepared rudimentary vessels for the first stage of the escape. Ruth returned to the main house one last time to collect important documents, maps, debt records, property certificates. Knowing the routine of the house perfectly, moved with the ghost in the corridors, leaving small dried herbs packages under each bed, not to cause physical damage, but to ensure that nightmares would torment the sleep of owners for many years. Jericho, in turn, coordinated the distribution of carefully accumulated provisions for weeks: dry bread, smoked meat, dried fruits, water bottles. Each family has received calculated feed to last precisely 5 days. The estimated time to reach the first security point, a Quilombola community in the depths of Bayou. Around 4 in the morning, when the rain finally ceased and a heavy silence fell on the plantation, the exodus began, not in panic or disorder, but in organized and silent procession. First children and the elderly, led by guides designated through a meticulously planned route that avoided the main paths. Then whole families moving as shadows between the trees, carrying only the essential and small objects of sentimental value. In a distance, a casual observer could confuse the procession with a night religious ceremony. Figures involved in dark cloths, moving at a constant and disciplined pace, without lamps or torches that could denounce their position. Approximately 120 people abandoned the plantation, must have a single shout at dawn without a single confrontation. The few who hesitated, out of doubt for some mistaken sense of loyalty, were kindly persuaded by Esther Marie, in person. For each one she had a specific word, a touch on her shoulder, a whispered promise to the ear. No one refused his final invitation. The last one to leave the perimeter of the plantation was Solomon, after confirming that all vessels had broken by carrying their designated passengers. As a final touch, he freed all the animals from the stables and corrals, opened the barns, and strategically set fire to processing warehouses, not the main house or the accommodation, only the places that represented economic exploitation in their purest form. Esther Marie in turn remained until the last possible moment. He returned to his cabin one last time to collect the little portrait of Lucille who kept hidden under a loose board. He quickly visited his daughter's tomb, depositing a single white rose harvested from the gardens of the main house. Finally, he left at the door of the car's cabin a small package containing specific herbs and a designed symbol that would later be recognized and feared in plantations throughout the South, a spiral with 9 points, representing what would be known as the 9 lessons of the Baptiste method. When the first ray of sun broke the horizon, illuminating the plantation in golden tones, no worker was left in the fields or lodgings. Only the wind moving between empty huts, animals roaming freely, and in the cabin of the overseers, 8 men on their last hour of earthly consciousness. The news of what happened in the plantation, should Doro spread as an uncontrolled fire, initially through official reports written in cautiously euphemistic language, avoiding specific details that could inspire imitative behaviors. The Orleans Parish Sheriff, in documenting his visit to the site 3 days after the events, merely recorded unhealthy conditions resulting from multiple deaths under non-conclusive circumstances. Authorities tried to drown out the details, fearing the potential for social contagion. However, the truth escaped inevitable cracks, multiplying in whispers between kitchens, steamboat cabins, and taverns frequented by rural workers. Unofficial reports circulated through coded letters exchanged between freed and Quilombola communities. Henry Mus Doro, after discovering the bodies, sent urgent telegrams to neighboring plantations, warning of particularly methodical and calculated nature insurrection. In private correspondence to the governor of Louisiana, he described events as not merely criminals, but ritualists, suggesting influence of forbidden religious practices of African origin. Within a month, similar incidents were reported in 3 different counties of Mississippi. In all cases, the same standard. Feeders known for brutality found paralyzed and systematically dismembered, with certain organs removed following specific standard. In all cases, identical designs left on doors or walls, the 9-point spiral, now known in official circles such as the Baptist brand. Around December of that same year, Georgia's plantations owners to Virginia had implemented desperate defensive measures, duplication of guards, prohibition of any healing practice, random inspections of cabins in search of suspicious materials. Some even built separated rooms specifically fortified for their overseers, with reinforced locks and armed guards. Official press was merely mentioning isolated criminal disorders or unfortunate accidents, but clandestine newspapers directed to the black community published detailed accounts, raising Esther Marie Baptiste to semi-man status. A publication by New Orleans referred to her as the Avenger, another in Charleston as the Hand of Retarded Justice. The psychological impact on enslaved communities and workers under analogous conditions was immense. Coded songs on the Lady of White, or Midnight Doctor, began to circulate in the fields, always with choruses that mentioned 9 lessons, or the final healing method. Small amulets representing the characteristic spiral appeared mysteriously in cabins, such as symbols of hope and resistance. The authorities, in turn, alternated between public negation and private panic. A confidential memorandum of the Louisiana Public Security Department, dated February 1883, warned, "The so-called Baptiste method represents an unprecedented threat to Southern social stability. Unlike previous brute force in numbers, this new modality operates through calculated terror specifically directed to control agents, demonstrating meticulous planning and advanced anatomical knowledge." Meanwhile, the communities that oppressed these workers were divided between those who intensified brutality as a response to fear, and others who silently began to moderate their most extreme methods, fearing becoming the next target. The mere mention of the name Baptiste on certain contexts was sufficient to empty a room. For the black and oppressed community, however, the method represented something fundamentally new, not only impulsive revenge or momentary fury, but calculated, systematic, and inevitable retribution. The implicit message was clear: justice could be delayed, but not indefinitely avoided. The knowledge that had so long had been used to heal and comfort when necessary became an accurate instrument of retribution. The response of the state came in March 1883, when the governor of Louisiana authorized the formation of a special task force dedicated exclusively to the capture of Esther Marie Baptiste and its known associates. 50 men, recruited from the most experienced fugitive slave hunters and former Confederate officers, were equipped with the most modern available features: Winchester 1873 rifles, specially trained hunting dogs, detailed swamp maps, and substantial rewards for information. The commander of this force, Colonel James Harrington, a three-width veteran and known for his relentlessness, said publicly, "In 90 days, the head of this calling, Avenger, will be shown in a public square as an example to all who challenge the natural order of society." The hunt initially focused on Louisiana's swamps, meticulously scouring each island, every stretch of land where Quilombola communities could settle. Informants were planted in liberated settlements, offering tempting rewards for any information about the white dress healer. For almost 6 months, however, Esther Marie and her main group looked ghost, always one step ahead of the stalkers, leaving only cold tracks and occasionally false clues that led to carefully prepared ambushes. His understanding of the terrain, combined with the support network that extended to marginalized communities, allowed them to evade sanctions that seemed infallible. In October 1883, however, luck changed. A denunciation, later attributed to a former mayor converted into informant after finding the mark on his door, provided the exact location of Esther Marie's main camp in the depths of Bayou Lafourche. Harrington mobilized all his strength to a massive and synchronized attack. What followed went to official records such as the Battle of Bayou, although surviving witnesses described something far from conventional combat. Surrounded by upper forces, with escape routes blocked by strategically positioned fools, Esther Marie and his closest followers opted for calculated resistance instead of surrender. For 3 days, government forces found disconcerting resistance, not just conventional weapons shots, but complex traps, whole areas made inaccessible by chemical mixtures that caused temporary blindness, and the terrible discovery that several of their own men had been infiltrated and replaced by CA supporters USA. At the dawn of the 4th day, when the victory finally seemed within the reach of official forces, what witnesses later describe as the last miracle of Baptiste, a dense mist, unusual for the station and region, suddenly descended over Bayou, reducing visibility less than 3 meters. Quando finalmente dissipou-se, horas depois, a maioria dos resistentes havia desaparecido inexplicavelmente, deixando para trás apenas os feridos graves e idosos que haviam escolhido voluntariamente permanecer. Among these was Esther Marie herself, seriously wounded by 2 shots, but still conscious when the soldiers finally reached the center of the camp. According to multiple reports, including Colonel Harrington's personal diary found decades later, she did not show fear or despair when captured. On the contrary, he kept an enigmatic smile as he was dragged out of his cabin. His last words, recorded by a young lieutenant with literary claims, have become legendary. "You can capture my body, but the method now exists beyond me. It is in the air that you breathe, in the water you drink, in the fear you will feel each time the night falls. I am just the beginning." Esther Marie Baptiste was performed by hanging on the morning of November 2, 1883, in a closed ceremony without public access, unusual decision justified by security concerns. Officially, it was convicted of multiple homicides, incitement to the insurrection and practice of prohibited rituals. His body was buried in an unclotted place, allegedly with cypress wood cuttings crossing specific points of anatomy, following local superstitions on how to prevent certain spirits from returning. What the authorities did not foresee, however, was the almost immediate transformation of Esther Marie de Criminal to the martyr, and eventually the mythical figure whose power would transcend his physical existence. In the years following its execution, reports of sightings proliferated throughout the South. A woman in a white dress walking among the sugarcane fields to the twilight, a mysterious healer appearing in remote plantations to treat sick children before disappearing without traces, a female voice singing old songs in Creole on new moon nights. Objects associated with their legacy have acquired almost sacred status among marginalized communities. Small dolls made of white cloth with 9 knots representing the 9 lessons, amulets containing the characteristic spiral carved in cypress wood, soil vials allegedly collected from the place of execution. Oral tradition perpetuated and expanded its history through coded songs, whispered tales at night, and rituals that mixed elements of African religions, Catholicism, and indigenous spiritual practices. In some communities, the belief was developed that pronouncing his full name 3 times before a mirror during the new moon would invoke his presence to punish oppressors. Official academics and historians, on the other hand, have actively worked to reduce their historical importance. Classifying planting events must have exaggerated incident by popular superstitions, or example of collective hysteria between rural population with limited formal education. This division between official history and popular memory persisted for generations. While schoolbooks barely mentioned the events or presented them as insignificant footnotes, families orally transmitted vivid details of the methods, motivations, and consequences of the resistance led by Esther Marie. Ironically, the systematic effort to erase its legacy only strengthened its symbolic power. The absence in official records turned it into an almost supernatural figure in collective consciousness, someone who existed simultaneously in the historical past and the eternal present, whose influence could be felt but never fully understood or controlled by the established power structures. A century after the original events, independent researchers began to dig up previously classified official documents, revealing the extent of the real impact of the Baptiste method on the reorganization of labor relations in the post-Reconstruction South. It has been found that, in the 5 years following its execution, more than 40 similar incidents were documented, leading to significant reforms under labor conditions, even if never publicly attributed to their influence. Perhaps the longer aspect of its legacy, however, was the permanence of the symbol, the 9-point spiral, which continued to appear in resistance contexts far beyond its original time and place. It was documented in civil rights movements in the 1950s and 1960s, resurfaced during protests for economic justice in the 1990s, and is occasionally in Manafee contemporary stations against systemic injustices. More than a historic person, Esther Marie Baptiste has become a concept, a principle, the incarnation of the fundamental truth that oppression systems, no matter how entrenched, inevitably create the seeds of their own destruction. Its history remains a powerful reminder that resistance assumes multiple forms, and that meticulous knowledge, patience, and planning can be more powerful weapons than brute force. In the words of an anonymous poet of the early 20th century, whose verses are still recited in night ceremonies in certain remote places of Louisiana, "She walks among the old, neither living nor dead, but eternal cypresses beyond the veil of time. Her method, such as patient water over stone, transforming the impossible into inevitable. If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched here,' so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Esther Marie's story touched her heart. Share so that Esther Marie Baptiste's memory is never forgotten."